We'll be going to item 8, presentation by Ashley Jeppson of the Nevada Department of Agriculture regarding the state's requirements for hemp.
Yes, for the record, Ashley Jeppson, Jeppson, with the Nevada Department of Agriculture, and I oversee our hemp program. So I know you guys are rampant in hemp, so I think hopefully this will address some questions, but the program's new and constantly evolving, so we're all kind of learning together with this, so I appreciate you guys taking the time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is kind of go and give a general background on how this program has progressed, where we're at now, and where we're hoping to go in the future, as much as we can potentially predict. Okay, so this is the general definition of what industrial hemp is. This is important because it really dives into the details as to the 3 types of certification that we have with the Department of Agriculture. So it includes cannabis sativa. Sometimes folks see the term cannabis and assume that's just marijuana. Of course, in this case, it's also hemp as well. And we'll talk how they're different here briefly. And I know most of you guys are probably aware, but just for folks that aren't, I wanted to touch on that. So it's any plant, part of the plant, including seeds, derivatives, and extracts, which is why we do the handler part, which we'll dive into more. And that involves delta-9 THC concentration of not more than 0.3%, which we'll go into more of what that means here shortly. Okay, this is a new program. We'll talk about kind of when it came on the federal level and when the state adopted it. The big challenge here is it's a cannabis plant. It looks exactly the same as marijuana. So there have been some industry challenges there, but they are, in fact, different. So hemp versus marijuana. Hemp is bred to have low THC, and THC is the cannabinoid that has the psychoactive effects, so it's essentially what gets you high. This specific hemp specifically is bred to not have that impact. So we'll talk about what it is used for, because that tends to be a big question. Well, if it's not doing that, then what's the big industry interest? So we'll dive into that. Just to clarify, marijuana, it's regulated by Department of Taxation, whereas hemp is regulated by the Nevada Department of Agriculture. So this program started with the 2014 Farm Bill, and with that, our state legislature saw the potential for this program to be adopted within the state. So shortly thereafter, the 2014 Farm Bill passing, allowing for it to pass with research and development. Our state legislatures also pushed through Senate Bill 305 to allow for the growing, and also shortly thereafter, Senate Bill 396 to allow for handling. And we'll break down what those specifically mean. So Department of Ag has been commissioned to pursue these forms of licensure. And these are all under our Nevada Administrative Code 557. So a couple important things to consider. So those 2 Senate bills are what require Department of Ag to look at eligibility and to ensure that we're promoting this industry while also trying to regulate it. Currently, I know this has been a big question. There are no deadlines for when applications come in our current statute. We'll talk more about that. However, licenses are valid for 1 calendar year. And what I mean by deadline, I mean by when applications come in to allow them to produce within that calendar year. So the 2014 Farm Bill, I'm going to talk a little bit about that because the 2018 Farm Bill is a little bit different. The 2014 was very specific to research and development projects. There were commercial restrictions. This created interstate challenges, and it only allowed for production to take place and some challenges with transportation for those states that actually adopted programs in conjunction with USDA. With that, there was also fairly undefined testing standards within that Farm Bill and some inconsistencies among states. So now that the 2018 Farm Bill has passed, a lot has changed. It's fully legalized hemp. It's lifted commercial restrictions. However, with that, states still have to have a state-approved program in conjunction with USDA. There's still that having to separate what is marijuana and what is hemp has to be done through a chemical analysis, which is why there still has to be a registration process through the Department of Ag so we can ensure that it truly is hemp by the definition that we talked about. Also, it further defined what the testing requirements are for hemp, and this has been a big topic this year. It actually listed Post Decarboxylated THC or an equivalent standard, so it's really looking at the chemical piece of what potentially is happening once heat's applied, which is typically what can potentially get you high. So that the standards have changed a little bit. With that, to move us in alignment with the new 2018 Farm Bill, there were two bills that passed this last legislative process. Senate Bill 347, and that was to modify Statute 557 to remove research and development and language in the regulations, and also to remove the term industrial. So a little bit more availability for what the product can be used for. Also with that, there's provisions that were laid out in the 2018 Farm Bill, and as a State Department of Ag that's participating, we have to make sure that we align with that to continue to have a program here. So it accounted for that as well. Also, Senate Bill 209 passed, and this will very likely impact you folks as well, because you're receiving likely processed products. So this requires processed products of hemp to have anything that's labeling CBD or THC to actually have it listed on the container, and there has to be a test verifying the concentration. So it's really trying to avoid the fraud that's been happening in the industry, so that there's more checks and balances in place. And there's more to the labeling requirements that we'll chat about too. So what is hemp used for? I know a lot of you guys are aware, but just in case, it's fairly widely used. Hemp seed oil, CBD is predominantly what folks are interested in. Right now, that's the big market draw. But there's other uses. It's been on the market for a number of years, but the drug piece, CBD, is where it's different. It can also be used for fiber, textiles, hemp grain, but predominantly in our state, folks are interested in CBD oil. So what is CBD? CBD is a different, it's still considered a drug by FDA, and there's a lot of anecdotal research that suggests that it does impact some of these specific disorders of epilepsy, depression, arthritis, some anti-inflammatory properties. There's more and more research happening with this. There is a drug called Epidiolex. It's the only drug that is currently FDA approved on the market that is CBD specific, that is geared at, as I mentioned, epilepsy. It's widely interested in being used with children because it doesn't have the psychoactive effects that potentially marijuana products could, while also helping to combat that condition. So with that, keep in mind it's a new industry. More and more research is coming out to show potential health benefits. So to support the industry, we've been commissioned to offer 3 different categories of licensure. So that's the grower, seed producer, and handler. And I want to preface, the seed producer, in order to be considered a seed producer, you also have to have a grower license. And we'll break down what each of these entails. So a grower is somebody that's generally just producing hemp. You can't grow it just recreationally, grow a few plants. You have to, per federal and state law, has to be registered with the Department of Ag, because we have to test it to make sure it's hemp. Seed producer, that's anybody that's actually growing and selling seed. And then handler, those that are receiving raw hemp and processing it into another commodity. So for instance, if somebody wanted to buy CBD oil and mix it in another capacity, that would not be under us. So for a grower, again, we're constantly learning. We're learning from our counties on how best to handle this, because it's quite an undertaking. There's a lot of moving pieces to this evolving industry. So we look to ensure that the parcel number that's listed on that application actually reflects what is on the register. So if somebody claims that they're the owner of that property, we go and verify who the actual owner is and ensure that they have a notarized letter confirming that they're authorized to grow on that property. With that, we also ask for county and city awareness and approval of production. The biggest challenge here is every county ordinances are different. So we're stepping around that, trying to figure out where things lie. Some of them have specific ordinances relevant to cannabis or hemp, and some of them don't. And some of them are catching up. So on our end, in the past, we've had folks attest to us that they're securing this, but we're getting more and more feedback from our county commissioners on better ways to do this. So we appreciate that. The other thing we look at is production size reflects application. So there have been instances where the application may reflect, say, 50 acres, and we get out and they're in 150 acres. And we have a pretty significant issue there, because if it's not registered with us, we're not overseeing it, we're not testing it, it's considered marijuana. And then, of course, we have to test the product. So we sample every farm, and we take samples for their varieties to ensure that it's under that 0.3% post decarboxylated or equivalent method THC. And that's required by FDA and it's USDA, and it's required in our regulations as well. So local jurisdictional approval, what does that mean? As I mentioned, every county is a little bit different. Some have zoning restrictions in place, some are developing them. Commercial water use, where we're working with the local or state water authority to better capture license numbers, permit numbers for those that are applying. Any other specific requirements the local ordinances have, the more information that we have or collaboration on ensuring that's met, the better. And then the other big question is, are county and city laws in place with hemp provisions or restrictions? Still trying to gather that information so we can make the proper decisions with approving applications. A big challenge that we're having is application falsification. So folks attesting that they've secured approvals and contacted folks that they have in fact not. So with that, if we're determining that folks are violating ordinances, they have not sought the proper approval per the authority that's existing within the counties, this can certainly result in the revocation of licensure. And we're hoping to actually better provide language in the next NAC revision that we do to give us a little bit more teeth on this as well. But the county should have teeth as well on that. And then also the violations of whatever the local code enforcement is, those local authorities can take action as well. So we're trying to share this information with those that are applying to make sure that they're doing their due diligence and working with folks. Okay, so to kind of give a timeline, step one, file an application. We review it for eligibility with that landowner approval, attestation, or documentation of jurisdictional approval. Once we issue the license, we will do a preliminary site inspection where we actually map the property. So we get out, map all corners so that we have on file what level of production they have, because we are getting calls fairly regularly from law enforcement. Is this a certified hemp grower, or is it marijuana? Is it an illegal grow? This at least allows us to confirm with them, we've mapped it, we've been there, they're registered with us. And then when we come out for the next inspection, it's their pre-harvest inspection. So we're coming out to test the crop and ensure that it's a legal crop. Cross-pollination is a huge concern for both the marijuana and the hemp industry. We're working with the governor currently to communicate this issue and come up with some solutions. There's economic and genetic purity issues and potentially compliance issues when cross-pollination is taking place. All the states are kind of in experiencing issues with how to combat this because we want to protect the industry, but it can be challenging to figure out based on different regions how far pollen can be distributed. Every area is a little bit different and how best to make those decisions. So what we have been doing, specifically if somebody's looking at seed production, we're asking for them to detail, well, first we look at their proximity to potentially somebody that's growing. If they are within a 5-mile radius, we ask them to provide how they're going to keep that contained or have it provisions where it's exclusively indoor, and we go out and inspect that it's truly exclusively indoor. So that's one way we've been trying to work through this, but it's a work in progress for sure. Let's see. And as I mentioned, the proximity issue, we're really looking at case by case. If folks are close to potentially a flower producer, so somebody growing for flower is growing for CBD, and if their crop is pollinated, they lose significant funds for the value of that crop. So it's a big player. And if they're in close proximity to a marijuana facility and any cross-pollination happens, it impacts both of them and can ultimately result in them having a failing crop. So definitely some challenges. We're trying to keep our ear to the ground on what growers are experiencing to best combat this issue where it's appropriate within our role. To give kind of an idea of sampling, just in case you're hearing anything from growers, we test per variety. A lot of folks are still doing research on this crop, as they should with anything that's new. So we take, for a larger field, we'll take 10 samples per variety, combine it together, and then sample that for THC. If they have one crop that does not pass, it exceeds the 0.3% THC, We will come out and retest if they would like that, resample, retest. If it still does not comply, that crop will have to be disposed of, but any other crops that passed will be able to move forward. So the big question, what happens if their THC concentration exceeds the 0.3% threshold? And I should mention the 0.3% threshold is established federal level. The crop has to be disposed of, and that's in the federal farm bill. So we work with each grower once we've reached the point where it's quite clear that we're at that stage. They're all structured a little bit different, so the cost of disposal, depending on what their options are, might be a little different, so we try to work with them case by case. So how to comply has been a big question. Going through the proper registration, asking questions, making sure that they're sourcing seed from reputable seed or mother plants from reputable growers. There has been a fair amount of fraud, unfortunately, in this industry. Looking at THC, the Department of Ag, we perform all the compliance testing to ensure that they meet those requirements. However, growers are certainly welcome to test their plant through third-party labs to just see what's happening with the THC concentrations. Ultimately, we will do the final testing, but it's great to find out during different stages and varieties what's happening. So frankly, we encourage folks to do that. Let's see. So monitor what's happening with your crop, it's important. And with any new industry, there's learning curves. So we've encouraged folks as much as possible to reach out together, learn together, and work together, but we know sometimes in industry that can be a challenge, but we are seeing a fair amount of collaboration, which is encouraging. So some of the challenges that we're still experiencing, and we've been fortunate to work with law enforcement fairly closely on some of these, is the transportation issue. So these crops look exactly the same as marijuana. So if something's being transported and it's stopped, how do I tell it's not marijuana? At this point, we're strongly advising growers to ensure, or those that are transporting, to ensure that they have the grower certificate, current grower certificate, or when the crop was harvested, and the testing. It needs to be Department of Ag testing because that's the true compliance testing. And that will at least allow the grower or the law enforcement to identify that they've gone through the proper channels, it's been tested. If there's issues, they're certainly welcome to share our contact information as well, because we're happy to confirm the status of those specific growers. But strongly behooves you to ensure that crop is transported with this documentation. As I mentioned, the pollination issue, misrepresentation from industry. We're having folks offering extraction services or seed services that really haven't necessarily been growing on their own, or don't have the best business practices. So we've been encouraging folks to establish a growers association where some of that can be combated. And the other big challenge is local jurisdictional approvals, codes, what's progressing, where we're at, and how to work best with our county partners. Okay, kind of jumped on this one already. I got ahead of myself. Sorry, this is all about the transportation I just talked about. So for seed, since seed is higher risk just because of the cross-pollination, we do look at our seed producers pretty closely. So when they apply, as I mentioned at the beginning, they have to have a grower license, and the seed is a secondary piece that we look at. So we will come out, we sample this crop as others. We do look at the varieties that folks want to plant, to assess if they've been grown here, if they're a higher risk, if they do have a reputation for testing high for 0.3%, we'll at least warn people, do this at your own risk. But the industry, especially the seed industry, it's continuing to progress and refine, so a lot of people want to be part of that research and development piece. With our seed manager with the hemp program, Russell Wilhelm, he also goes out and will look at potential cross-pollination between different varietals. So when we have an applicant list a specific seed producer, if we know those varietals are likely being cross-pollinated between multiple varietals, it at least allows us to share some of that information, whereas some folks are really trying to keep the varietals isolated so that there's not cross-pollination and they're maintaining that genetic purity. Probably more in the weeds than you were looking at, but just an added service that we're trying to provide to work with our growers and industry. Okay, jumping into the handler one. So as I mentioned, this is for those that are receiving raw hemp. It's not processed products. They're receiving the raw hemp and then they're processing that product into another commodity or product. So This is fairly limited on what that actually means within our authority. So it's typically if somebody is doing that first extraction process, so they're taking in raw hemp, extracting, and potentially extracting for CBD crude oil. Once they then try to refine that oil into something else, it's no longer in our hands. It could also be specific seed cleaning, grinding, things along those lines are what we specifically regulate. Processed products fall under our health authorities, and they're in a tough situation as well, in that there's certain hemp products they can regulate and certain ones they can't. So CBD is kind of one of those that's a little bit in the gray area, which we're working to overcome on a national level, really. So for handler criteria, we look at, do you have a business license? For our grower, if you have a business license, you must provide it. For a handler, you need to have a business license. If you're modifying or retrofitting a facility, you need to have a certificate of occupancy. Much of the handler stuff, it's determined on the county and the ordinances that are specifically present there, which again is a challenge. So the things we know to look for is if they're retrofitting a building, certificate of occupancy. If they're using combustible solvents, you need to have a fire inspection. You can imagine why. If we see somebody that's trying to apply for a residential area and using combustible solvents, we won't sign off on that, and nor would anybody within the county level. So those are the things we know specifically to look for, but as we're working with folks, we're hoping that we'll get more sign-off or secondary documents from the county level that will help us determine that all the right steps have gone through and that they're meeting your requirements as well. As I mentioned, certain processed products, they fall under the authority of our health authorities. The big issue is since our industry is most interested in CBD oil, this is currently, the actual food piece is currently unregulated. So if our health authorities are not issuing health permits for CBD products, so there can be some challenges there. So we're recommending folks research other extraction facilities. There are other states that have provisions like Colorado, or look at a similar food establishment and adopt some best practices for food safety. We have some resources on our website as well, but we don't do processed products, so it's kind of a different ballgame. So somebody might get approved for entering into a handling facility and able to do some limited processing, but it doesn't mean that the specs of that building are meeting all the requirements for something that will be consumed. And also, any finished product from a handler, it has to test less than 0.3% post decarboxylated delta-9 THC. So for the oil extraction, you're getting a concentrated THC level. They have to find a means of ensuring that that finished product that's sold to the consumer meets that 0.3% THC. Some responsibilities of handlers, they need to ensure that the people that are supplying their hemp are certified with the Department of Agriculture. As I mentioned, they should research other food establishments to make sure that they're thinking through the food safety steps. And then also they're responsible for ensuring they're meeting all local regulations, so permitting, water rights, whatever it may be. I mentioned there's the limitations on CBD products. So CBD products are still considered a drug by FDA. So per FDA guidance, they cannot be added to food products, so food ingredients. So if you're seeing gummies or anything that's been mixed with food, it's not permitted by FDA. Anything with medical claims, also not permitted. Like anything else with medical claims, they have to go through FDA trials and be registered with them in order to make those claims, to ensure that the consumer is truly informed and that that's been validated. However, those that are interested in flour, by like flour, F-L-O-U-R, or hemp seed oil, hemp hearts, things along those lines, those you can absolutely get a health permit for. Different food products, it's not the same as the CBD, different hemp products. As I mentioned, the Epidiolex, it's the first approved CBD pharmaceutical that's been issued on the market. It's gone through the FDA trials, it's used for seizures. It went through all the processes, so it can make the health claims, it can be prescribed. They did find some potential issues with dosage rates to certain age groups, so it's something that's overseen under a medical professional, and that's another reason why CBD, they're pushing for certain levels to be monitored. I mentioned the labeling requirements. You guys are going to see CBD products out there widely. You already do. So we've been working with our health authorities extensively because pretty much right when the 2018 Farm Bill was signed off on, We thought these products were going to be legalized, and then FDA came out with the response that medical claims, food ingredients with CBD are not permitted and they're considered adulterants. So that kind of threw a little bit of a curveball on us. So we've been working with our health authorities to figure out, okay, well, what does that specifically mean for just CBD oil in itself? So if it's not being added to food products, if it doesn't have medical claims, health authorities are not pulling products or requiring anything further. But once that's opened and starts being added to food in restaurants, or it's been mixed with candy or whatever it may be, then we're violating FDA's guidance and we have a problem. But the CBD oil by itself, under those two provisions, they're allowing it to be sold. These are some of the things that we've seen. Hemp gummy a day keeps all your pain and anxiety away. We're seeing these things advertised fairly widely. This kind of advertising is not permitted. If they want to go through the drug trials and through FDA, then it's a different situation. Commercial feed comes up fairly often. Can hemp be used in commercial feed? At this point, per the Association of American Feed Control Officials, it cannot. Same thing, they're doing research to see what the potential health impacts could be to animals. Colorado and AFCO are doing fairly extensive research together to figure this piece out, but this is specific to the sale of commercial feed. If somebody is feeding it to their own animals, that's not the sale of commercial feed, so it's there's no restrictions there. Moving ahead, so we have, in 2017, we had 65 certified growers. 2018, we had 113. And this year we're well over 200 and they keep rolling in. So similar to yourselves, trying to keep up has been a challenge. So we're trying to get the needed staff to provide the education and outreach to this industry, to combat and provide the inspections and resources that need to continue to happen and work with our state and federal partners. We did just get a full-time position approved that will be starting in October. At this point in time, we've been using staff from other programs because it takes a lot to get a position, especially with the unknowns of this industry, not knowing what direction it's going and how much growth would take place. So we're finally moving forward to be able to get some staff. With that, we're hoping in the future to provide potentially some conferences and 2 or 3 day trainings, because there's a lot of moving pieces to this on your level, economically, and trying to make sure that our growers are successful, but also operating within the means where they need to be. Inspections are continuing to be a combined effort among our program staff and working with local folks. So we're all learning from each other.
Now, one of our biggest problems is obviously we're behind the ball. I mean, we got a letter a few years ago when hemp started here that essentially came from your division and told us to keep our hands off of hemp. Okay, so unfortunately, we obeyed the letter, and now we find ourselves way behind the ball. I need some kind of guidance from you in the form of a letter or something that says we can now regulate hemp and to what extent. So I'm asking you here in public to, at some point in time, pretty quickly, get me something that says what I can do, because it's out of control here. We've had people arrested because they're firing guns, because they're growing hemp next to their bedroom window. I mean, we have applications, and you've approved 4,000 square feet in people's backyards, and we find out they're using their domestic water to do it. So, I mean, we've had conversations before, so I'm officially asking you for something that says, Nye County, you can regulate hemp. Similar, I would like it to say similar to marijuana, because I actually get money from marijuana. I get nothing from hemp except aggravated people. Okay? So,
what is your perspective at this point with the spacing, the 1 mile, 5 mile? I've seen that in your backup here. Where are we currently at with that?
So we're trying to find how best to, if it's deemed that it's within our authority to monitor and separate the distance, we would like to have language there that if there is a proximity issue determined, that it would allow us to revoke or deny certification. So, if we're observing that plants are pollinating and they're right next to somebody that's growing for flower or seed, they violated the provisions of their application. That's not what they reported, and it would allow us to do something. It's challenging because plants can change quickly. They can seed quickly. Even when buying feminized seed, it can happen. So we're trying to put words in place where it's really for folks that aren't monitoring their crop and staying on top of it, that we can do something, but where we can have some leniency in where not every case fits the same, because that's just not the situation.
One of the biggest complaints that I've heard and had people address is the fact that it has a lot of odor. And in the areas where they have particularly large grows, it's running residential people crazy. Because the residential people were there first, and then somebody came along and put in a big field of hemp, and there's basically nothing we can do about it. Are you people looking at any kind of control in regards to odor, or is there anything at all?
So as I told the chairman, it's within your authority to put limitations on where they can be, on county authority to establish ordinances that would allow you guys to dictate that. It's not in our regulations, and some air qualities divisions monitor it, but it's certainly within your means to establish regulations that would allow for this program to fit more of what your local needs are. Absolutely. And I apologize, you got a letter from our division in the past, but I can tell you we're happy to work with you, and by all means, you're welcome to establish those ordinances and go through this public process.
I realize in our conversations I get it, but I still have a letter that says you can't, and I need a letter that says you can, that's all.
So when you're issuing a license, you do not take into consideration any of the surrounding neighborhoods as far as if this huge 400-acre plot is going to be a detriment to the people around it. You don't even consider that. You just give them a license to.
So we would look at your ordinances. If you had the restriction, and there are some that do, where they have to have the filtration systems or be exclusively indoor, we would lean on that because we don't have the authority to deny it based on that.
So we need to get that done right away.